Is justice always as clear as it seems? In the final appeal, David Kerrigan, a lawyer known for taking on lost causes, faces the most complex case of his career. His client, accused of murdering an influential businesswoman, swears he's innocent. As David delves into the details of the case, he discovers that nothing is as it seems. The evidence leads to a web of corruption, betrayals, and secrets that could shake the very foundations of the legal system. With every new discovery, the threats grow more dangerous, and David realizes he's dealing with powerful forces that will do anything to keep the truth hidden. But how far is he willing to go to save his client? And what's really at stake when everything points to a conspiracy far beyond the courtroom? Get ready for a story where the line between right and wrong becomes blurred, and the suspense builds with every step toward the unexpected. David Kerrigan, a defense attorney known for his skill in solving seemingly impossible cases, was about to face the biggest challenge of his career. That morning, as he reviewed the new case in his Boston office, he felt a different weight. Jack Thompson, his client, was a simple man with no criminal record, accused of murdering Cynthia Bell, an influential and controversial businesswoman. The evidence seemed irrefutable. Jack's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, and security cameras near the crime scene confirmed his presence. All signs pointed to him. However, David felt something didn't quite add up. The defense is doomed if it follows the traditional path, he thought as he read through the reports. Jack's background didn't match that of a murderer. He decided that the strategy had to be different: dig deep into Cynthia's life. He began gathering information. Cynthia was known for her aggressive business tactics, having faced several lawsuits in recent years. Many competitors and former partners considered her ruthless, and rumors circulated that she maintained a network of powerful allies behind the scenes. This raised the first red flag in David's mind. There was more to this story than a simple crime of passion. In his early meetings with Jack, David noticed his client's resistance to openly discussing his relationship with the victim. When questioned, Jack simply said that he didn't know her well, despite the two being seen together on several occasions. "She helped me with some investments," Jack responded evasively. David knew he needed to dig deeper. The trial began with the prosecution presenting a strong case. The forensic evidence and testimonies painted Jack as the sole person responsible for Cynthia's death. But as the hearings progressed, David received disturbing information from a private investigator he had hired. One of these leads suggested that Cynthia was involved in money laundering schemes with companies tied to the government. The real shock came when David discovered a series of encrypted emails between Cynthia and important political figures. The messages indicated that she was about to expose a conspiracy involving millions of dollars in fraudulent public contracts. David knew this could be the key to exonerating Jack. But to prove his theory, he would need much more than speculation. Back in the courtroom, David began challenging the evidence presented by the prosecution, pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline of the crime and the prosecutor's narrative. He subtly suggested that Cynthia had more powerful enemies than previously thought, which intrigued the judge. As the case advanced, the lawyer realized he was uncovering a web of corruption larger than he had anticipated. And then, when he least expected it, one of the key witnesses against Jack suddenly withdrew, citing personal reasons. David felt the chill of conspiracy closing in around him but still didn't know the full extent of the interests at stake. Who's pulling the strings, he wondered. Deep down, a voice told him that the real battle was just beginning. David barely had time to process the witness's withdrawal when an unexpected visitor arrived at his office. A tall man, dressed in an impeccable suit and dark glasses, introduced himself only as Collins. He didn't offer a business card or any further explanations about who had sent him. "I know you're digging into things you shouldn't, Mr. Kerrigan," he said with a disturbing calmness. "My advice is simple: stop now." David, accustomed to dealing with veiled threats in the legal world, kept his composure. "If you're here to try to intimidate me, you're wasting your time," he replied, crossing his arms. Collins didn't react. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Kerrigan. I'm here to warn you. This isn't just about your client. It's much bigger than you think." Collins left without further explanation, leaving David with a growing sense of unease. Who had sent him? And why were they so desperate to get him to abandon the case? Every new move seemed to draw more attention, and not the kind of attention a defense attorney expects. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution continued to insist that Jack Thompson had personal motives for killing Cynthia, but they didn't provide any new compelling arguments. Something felt off. David decided it was time to confront Jack directly. In the prison visiting room, David faced his client, who looked more and more worn down with each passing day. "You're not telling me everything, Jack. If there's something I need to know, now is the time." Jack hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. I didn't kill her, David. But I also can't tell you everything. If I do, they'll come after me and my family. The revelation made David lean forward. Who are they, Jack? You need to trust me. After a few minutes of silence, Jack finally spoke. Cynthia was involved with dangerous people. I was just a pawn in her scheme. I was used, just like many others. Jack's words confirmed what David had begun to suspect, but they still didn't explain everything. Then why were you framed? David pressed. Jack shook his head in frustration. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now, I'm paying the price. Meanwhile, the private investigator David had hired, Sam Perkins, brought surprising new information. A series of suspicious bank transfers connected Cynthia to an offshore company based in the Cayman Islands. The company was linked to government contracts, but the most interesting name in the documents was one of the state's biggest political sponsors, Senator Richard Monahan. David began to realize that this was more than just a business dispute. With this new lead, David called a secret meeting with Sam. Do these transfers prove that Cynthia was laundering money for Monahan? David asked. Sam looked at him, deep in thought. It's hard to say for sure, but there's definitely a connection between the two. Monahan might be involved up to his neck in this scheme. David knew that if Monahan was involved, he was stirring up a hornet's nest that could be deadly. This is much bigger than we thought, David murmured, reflecting on the growing complexity of the case. What if Cynthia was about to expose everything and was silenced for it? Sam agreed but also warned him, if you keep going, David, you'll be entering dangerous territory. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but David knew he was dealing with powerful enemies. If he wanted to save Jack and reveal the truth, he would have to act fast, and with extreme caution. The trial was becoming a smokescreen for something much bigger, and the deaths that once seemed like accidents were beginning to take on sinister new meanings. When David returned to court the next day, he felt the eyes of many people in the room, prosecutors, journalists, even his own defense colleagues, paying more attention to him than usual, as if they knew something was about to happen. The air was thick with tension. As he awaited the start of the session, his mind raced, searching for the next step. Something told him that the forces behind Cynthia's death hadn't yet shown all their cards. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The murmurs echoed off the walls like waves of distrust, and David felt the weight of the conspiracy closing in around him. He knew every move he made was being watched. The eyes of the judge, the jury, the prosecution, and even Jack seemed to wait for his next step. During the break, Sam called David with an urgent update. I found something that might interest you, he said, his voice tense. One of Cynthia's business partners, a man named Benjamin Holloway, disappeared mysteriously 2 days before her death. David frowned. What do you mean, disappeared? He just vanished. Without a trace. And more, he was also involved in dealings with Senator Monahan. David felt a rush of adrenaline. Holloway, one of Cynthia's trusted associates, vanished before the murder? The plot was getting darker. He knew he needed to bring this information to light, but without solid proof, he couldn't go far in court. However, the connection to Monahan was something he couldn't ignore. In court, David began to press the prosecution's key witness, a financial analyst who had linked Jack to fraudulent transactions. These transfers you're describing, David said firmly, could have been made by anyone with access to the system, correct? The man hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Yes, theoretically. David turned to the jury, noticing hesitation on their faces. He knew he needed to plant the seed of doubt. So, you're stating that the accused, Jack Thompson, was the only one who could have made these transfers, even though other people had the same level of access? The analyst began to stutter, visibly uncomfortable. Well, I can't say with absolute certainty. With this small victory, David began to see the prosecution's case start to crumble, albeit slowly. But he knew the prosecutors had more tricks up their sleeves. And they didn't take long to act. Later that day, as David was reviewing files in his office, an envelope was delivered with no return address. Inside were photos of Sam Perkins in an alley, being confronted by 2 men. In some of them, Sam was lying on the ground, bloodied. The message was clear. David felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he was venturing into dangerous territory, but this was a direct threat. Desperate, he tried calling Sam, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Damn it, he muttered, slamming the phone down on his desk. The conspiracy was real, and it was willing to eliminate anyone who dared to dig too deep. That night, David barely slept. He was determined to keep going, but he knew his own life was now in danger. The next morning, Jack looked more grim than ever. They know, David, Jack said, his voice trembling. They know you're getting close, and they won't stop until they destroy you. David tried to appear unfazed, but the threat hung over him like a shadow. "Let them try," he replied, though he felt the weight of uncertainty in his words. In court, David tried to maintain his composure as the prosecution called a surprise witness, a former employee of Cynthia. The woman, visibly nervous, began to recount how Jack had threatened Cynthia months before the murder, following a heated argument about investments. "He was furious," she said, glancing at Jack. "He said she would pay for ruining his life." David stood up calmly and began crossing his arms as he paced in front of the jury. "So, you're telling us that despite working for Cynthia, you didn't mention this threat in any of the previous reports? And why not?" The woman began to stammer, her confidence crumbling under David's incisive questioning. I was afraid. Cynthia said no one would believe me." David smiled slightly. "Afraid of what?" "That someone like Cynthia, a woman surrounded by powerful allies, could make your life miserable if you spoke up?" The room fell silent. The jury was paying attention, the wheels of doubt starting to turn in their minds. That afternoon brought another surprise. David was leaving the courthouse when he received a call from a blocked number. A raspy, masked voice spoke on the other end. "Give up, Kerrigan. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The threat was short and direct, and David stood frozen in the street, watching the traffic around him as he tried to process what he had just heard. The forces behind Cynthia's murder were clearly moving to protect their secrets. But who was the real enemy? Was Jack merely a puppet? Or was there something much darker at play, something David had yet to uncover? He felt the truth was getting closer, but with every step he took, the danger increased. He knew that at any moment, he could be the next to fall. David knew that if he wanted to expose the conspiracy behind Cynthia's death, he had to act quickly and wisely. His adversaries were powerful, connected to the highest levels of power. The threats didn't intimidate him, but they made him tread carefully, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. That afternoon, David decided to meet with an investigative journalist, Eddie McCall, an old acquaintance who worked for one of Boston's biggest newspapers. If anyone could help uncover the web of corruption he was beginning to unravel, it was Eddie. In a discreet bar, far from cameras and media attention, they talked. "David, if Monahan's name is involved in this, you know the kind of enemies you're making, right?" Eddie said as he lit a cigarette, his narrow eyes fixed on the lawyer. David nodded. "Yes, but I can't turn back now. My client is being framed for something much bigger. I need solid proof, Eddie. Connections. Bank transfers. Anything we can use to link Cynthia directly to Monahan and expose the whole scheme." Eddie scratched his beard, thoughtful. "I have some contacts that might help us trace the money. But if you go after Monahan, he'll hit back hard. The guy is one of the biggest fundraisers for the party and has the system in his hands." David knew he couldn't rely solely on the legal system. If Monahan was involved, there were politicians, judges, and prosecutors aligned to protect his interests. But what made him most uneasy was Benjamin Holloway's disappearance. Cynthia's partner could be the key to unraveling the whole mess. He just needed to find him, or discover what had really happened to him. As the case progressed in court, David's efforts to discredit the prosecution's witnesses were working. However, prosecutor Michael Hill played a new card. A last-minute witness, an investment broker named Robert Harris, claimed to have seen Jack and Cynthia in a heated argument days before her death at a gala event. Harris described the scene in surprising detail, even mentioning that Jack had left the event in a rage. David, aware that this witness was there to divert attention from the real conspiracy, began to destabilize Harris's testimony. "Mr. Harris, do you happen to remember anyone else at the gala?" David asked, his voice calm but lethal. Harris began to falter. "Well, there were many people. I don't remember everyone." "Interesting. Because according to the security footage from the gala, Jack Thompson wasn't there. In fact, he was in another city that night. How do you explain that?" David pressed. The jury leaned forward, eager to see Harris's reaction. The broker started sweating, stammering as he tried to justify himself. The prosecution was clearly fabricating witnesses to strengthen a case that was beginning to unravel. Outside the courtroom, the threats against David continued to grow. One night, as he was leaving the office late, he noticed a black car parked across the street. The figure inside seemed to be watching him closely. The lawyer ignored it, but deep down, he knew he was being followed. The tension was mounting, and he could no longer trust anyone. The turning point came 2 days later when Eddie showed up with crucial information. "I managed to track part of the money Cynthia was moving. And there's a connection to a shell company, Westbridge Holdings, used in shady public contract operations." David frowned. "And who's behind Westbridge?" Eddie smiled, tossing a dossier onto the table. "You won't believe it, Benjamin Holloway." Holloway hadn't disappeared by accident. He was deeply involved in the corruption scheme, and his disappearance was likely an attempt to hide, or to be eliminated. This made Holloway both a target and a potential key player in the game. David knew he needed to find Holloway before it was too late. If we can catch Holloway and connect him to Westbridge, we can dismantle this operation. And Jack will be exonerated. But Eddie warned him, if Holloway is running from Monahan and his allies, they're probably hunting him down too. It won't be easy. In the following days, David began tracking Holloway, using all his resources. The tension was increasing. Sam Perkins, still missing, was another concern. Time was running out, and David's enemies were closing in as the trial dragged on to its final stretch. The breaking point came when David received an anonymous message at his office, with an address. "He's here," read the unsigned note. Knowing it could be a trap, David hesitated, but the feeling of being so close to the truth was irresistible. At the specified location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, he finally found Benjamin Holloway. But what he discovered there left him in shock. Holloway was wounded, visibly scared, as if he had spent weeks on the run. They'll kill me if I talk," Holloway muttered as David tried to calm him down. Before David could get more information, the screech of tires interrupted their conversation. Several cars arrived at the scene. "You need to get out of here now," Holloway shouted. David ran toward the exit, but not before hearing the first gunshot echo through the warehouse. David barely escaped through the side doors of the warehouse as the gunfire grew more intense. The sound of bullets ricocheting off the metal walls was deafening. He knew Holloway was in danger, but going back meant facing certain death. As he sprinted through the shadows of the night, his breath quickened, and the footsteps of his pursuers drew closer. It was a chase. Turning a corner, David spotted a narrow alley and hid behind a stack of boxes. His heart pounded. He tried to control his breathing, listening to the footsteps growing ever closer. 2 armed men passed by, scanning every corner of the warehouse. "He couldn't have gotten far," one of them muttered. David crouched even lower, hoping they wouldn't see him. When the footsteps finally faded, David seized the opportunity to quietly leave the alley. He ran toward a taxi parked on the main street, got in, and told the driver to take him far away as quickly as possible. As the car sped off, David exhaled the breath he had been holding. As the taxi carried him back to the city, David reflected on what had just happened. He had finally found Benjamin Holloway, but the ambush proved that his enemies were one step ahead. Holloway knew too much, and those who wanted to keep the corruption hidden were willing to kill him to silence any threat. Now, more than ever, David knew time was against him. If he didn't act quickly, Jack Thompson would be convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and more lives would be lost in the process. When he arrived at his apartment, David found a new surprise. An envelope, left under the door, contained only a single sheet inside. "Your last chance to back off." The letters were simple, but the message was unmistakable, a final threat. David felt a chill run down his spine. The enemies he was facing were relentless and wouldn't hesitate to destroy him. For a brief moment, he thought about pulling out. But Jack, his career, and his integrity were at stake. He couldn't stop now. The next day in court, David was more prepared than ever to expose the fraud. He called to the stand a banking audit expert who had reviewed the transfers linked to Cynthia and Holloway. "These accounts show a series of suspicious transactions," the expert said firmly. "Money moved to tax havens and directly tied to the shell company Westbridge Holdings." The prosecutor, Michael Hill, immediately tried to discredit the testimony, arguing that it had no direct connection to the case. "This is irrelevant to the murder of Cynthia Bell," he protested. But David had an ace up his sleeve. "Mr. Prosecutor," he said, walking slowly toward the jury, "if Cynthia was about to expose a multi-million-dollar corruption scheme involving powerful political figures, that gives someone a motive to kill her, doesn't it?" The prosecution was silent for a moment, clearly caught off guard. David knew he was getting close to something big. Cynthia wasn't killed out of revenge or a personal feud with Jack. She had become a target for getting involved in something bigger than herself, a scheme involving Senator Richard Monahan and his corrupt allies. But then, an unexpected twist occurred. During a break, while reviewing his documents, David received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was hoarse and low, almost imperceptible. "David Kerrigan? I need to see you now." The man didn't identify himself but sounded urgent. "If you want to know the truth about Holloway and Cynthia, meet me at the location I'll provide." Distrustful but aware that he couldn't ignore this opportunity, David followed the instructions. The meeting was set in an underground parking garage. When he arrived, he found a man wearing a dark coat, his face partially hidden under a cap. Holloway knew too much. He was trying to run, but he couldn't escape, the man said bluntly. The same will happen to you if you don't walk away from this case. David stared at the stranger, trying to understand his motives. Who are you? Why are you telling me this? The man looked around, making sure no one else was nearby. I used to work for Monahan. I was part of the scheme, but I got out before things turned ugly. They'll kill anyone necessary to keep this buried. Before David could question him further, the man quickly walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. The revelation made it clear, Holloway had been silenced because he knew too much, and now David was also in their crosshairs. With every new discovery, the danger loomed ever closer, and he realized there were traitors everywhere. Back in court, David tried to maintain his composure, but the pressure was building. He still didn't have all the pieces to the puzzle, but one thing was clear: the conspiracy ran deeper with each new twist. Monahan and his web of corruption were responsible for Cynthia's death. And now, with Holloway gone, the next target was him. That night, as he struggled to fall asleep, David wondered just how far the people involved were willing to go. Had he already been betrayed by someone inside the courtroom itself? Who could he really trust? The only certainty was that the battle was far from over. The next morning, David entered the courtroom knowing the noose was tightening around him. He could feel the weight of the threats, the constant shadow of the conspiracy looming. As he walked into the courtroom, his eyes scanned every face, searching for some clue, some hidden traitor among the observers. But it was useless. The enemies he was fighting were masters at hiding in the shadows. Prosecutor Michael Hill seemed more confident than usual, and that troubled David. Something was about to happen, he could feel it. When Hill stood up to call the next witness, David held his breath. To his surprise, the name that echoed in the courtroom was Sam Perkins. David froze for a moment. His investigator, who had been missing, was about to testify. When Sam entered the room, he looked worn down, with a recent cut on his face and tired eyes. Something about him didn't seem right, but the worst was yet to come. Sam sat in the witness chair, and in a monotone, distant voice, began to speak. "I was hired by David Kerrigan to investigate the death of Cynthia Bell," he said without looking directly at David. "And during my investigation, I discovered that Jack Thompson did, in fact, have personal reasons to kill her." David felt the ground shift under his feet. What is he doing, Sam, he thought, his heart pounding in his chest. The betrayal of his own investigator was something he hadn't foreseen. But why? What had they done to him? "I found evidence connecting Jack directly to the crime," Sam continued, his voice cold. "Including witnesses who claimed to have seen him threatening Cynthia days before her death." The prosecutor smiled discreetly, while the jury seemed to absorb every word Sam said. David knew it didn't make sense. The evidence he and Sam had gathered pointed to a corruption scheme, implicating figures far more significant, like Monahan. But now, his own ally was helping to trap him in a deadly conspiracy. David requested a pause in the testimony. He needed time to gather his thoughts. As he stepped out into the hallway, he found Sam waiting there. "What the hell is going on?" David confronted him, grabbing his arm. Sam looked away, shame and fear written all over his face. They got to me, David. They threatened me. My family. They said they'd kill my daughter if I didn't cooperate." David let go of Sam, feeling a wave of anger and frustration wash over him. Now everything made sense. His enemies were willing to do anything, even use Sam as a puppet to incriminate him. But despite the betrayal, David still needed Sam. "Listen, Sam," David said, lowering his voice. "I know you're under threat, but you know Jack is innocent. And if we don't do something now, you and I will be the next ones." Sam hesitated but eventually nodded in agreement. "They have people everywhere, David. I tried to fight it, but I couldn't." He handed David a flash drive that had been hidden in his pocket. "This is all I could get before they caught me. It has details about the bank transfers, the connections to Monahan. I couldn't decode everything, but it might be what you need." Back in court, David knew he needed to turn the tide immediately. He stood up with the flash drive in his pocket, his mind racing with his next move. When Sam returned to the witness stand, David questioned him directly. "Sam, you mentioned evidence connecting Jack to the crime. Could you tell us how you obtained this information?" Sam, visibly uncomfortable, began to stumble over his answers, clearly trying to avoid exposing the truth. But David pressed on. "Sam, you were forced to lie, weren't you? Your family was threatened, and you're here because they made you do this." Prosecutor Hill immediately stood up, protesting, but David continued. "The system is being manipulated, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. This man was forced to say what they wanted because the people involved in this case have the power to do so." The judge called for order in the court, but David knew he had planted the seed of doubt. The jury began to murmur, visibly confused. Hill, on the other side, was growing increasingly agitated. During the break, while David tried to decode the contents of the flash drive with the help of a forensic expert, a series of new revelations came to light. The transactions linked to Westbridge Holdings were even broader than they had imagined. Millions were being funneled into secret accounts, and Monahan was at the center of it all. But the biggest shock came when one final transfer, made just days before Cynthia's murder, showed the ultimate destination of the money. It was an offshore account in the name of Jack Thompson. David felt the impact of the discovery. This changed everything. Jack had been involved from the start. David was speechless. All the clues had pointed to Monahan and his allies, but the real traitor, the one who had always been a step ahead, was his own client. The man he had sworn to defend, who claimed to be the victim of a conspiracy, had been manipulating everything from the beginning. David felt the weight of betrayal crash down on him. Jack had been involved with Monahan, and Cynthia, upon discovering the scheme, had been killed for becoming a threat. Now David was trapped in a deadly game, where the real enemy had been at his side all along. David felt the devastating impact of the truth as it unraveled. Jack Thompson, the man he had defended so passionately, was not a victim, he was part of the scheme. The sense of betrayal hit him hard. The trial, the threats, the conspiracy. Everything had been part of a carefully orchestrated theater by Jack and his accomplices. Now, in the courtroom, David faced a difficult choice. He could maintain the charade, continue defending a guilty man, or risk everything, his career, his life, to expose the truth and seek justice. But how could he convince the jury without enough solid evidence? He knew his only chance was to use the information on the flash drive to directly link Jack to Monahan's corruption network. When the session resumed, David stood, facing the courtroom with a calm exterior. He knew that every word now was critical. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice firm, "throughout this trial, we've been led to believe that Jack Thompson is an innocent victim of a conspiracy. But what I'm about to present will change the course of this case entirely." Prosecutor Hill shot him a look of disbelief, clearly confident that David had no way out of the trap that had been set. But David was ready. He connected the flash drive to the courtroom's projection system and began displaying the secret documents that Sam had retrieved. "These are the bank transfers made by the shell company, Westbridge Holdings," David explained. "They show a steady flow of money into various offshore accounts. But the most surprising detail is that one of these accounts belongs to none other than Jack Thompson." The courtroom fell silent. The jury turned to look at Jack, who now wore an indecipherable expression, his facade of innocence beginning to crumble. This proves that Jack was involved in fraudulent operations with Cynthia Bell and other partners, including Senator Monahan. When Cynthia discovered the scale of the scheme and threatened to expose it, she was killed. David turned to Jack, his gaze cold. "You knew everything, didn't you, Jack? Cynthia was a threat to you, and that's why she was silenced. You were never the victim, you were part of the plan all along." Finally, Jack broke his silence. He smirked slightly, a cynical and cruel smile. "Truth is relative, David. You should know that." His words echoed through the courtroom, dripping with cynicism. "But you're wrong about one thing. I didn't kill Cynthia. I just set her on the right path. Others did the dirty work for me." David was stunned by Jack's coldness. The man he had worked alongside and fought for was now confessing, not explicitly, but with a calculated arrogance. The jury was shocked. Prosecutor Hill attempted to intervene, but David's revelations had already changed the game entirely. The tension in the room was palpable. The judge allowed a brief recess, enough time for David to catch his breath. Outside, Eddie McCall, the journalist, was waiting for him. "You did it, David. This is going to blow up in the press. Monahan and his allies are going down." David knew he had uncovered the truth, but the cost had been high. Jack would be convicted, but not before leaving one final scar. "You think you've won, David?" Jack said as he was led back to his cell. "There are others like me. Monahan might fall, but the system is unbeatable." David watched as Jack was escorted by the guards, his smirk still visible. Jack's words echoed in David's mind. He knew that the fight for real justice was far from over. The corruption networks he had exposed were just the tip of the iceberg, and there were still many other players hidden in the shadows. In the end, the trial was a bittersweet victory. Jack was convicted, and the connections between Monahan and organized crime and financial fraud were finally exposed. But David knew that the personal cost of this victory was enormous. Sam had disappeared once again, probably seeking protection after betraying his employers. Eddie McCall, meanwhile, was preparing to publish one of the biggest stories of his career, while David himself stood on the sidelines, reflecting on the weight of the truth and the consequences of pursuing it. That night, David walked through the empty streets of Boston, feeling the cold breeze on his face. He had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The system Jack had mentioned was still there, corrupt and unrelenting. David, however, knew he couldn't give up. He had unmasked a powerful enemy, but now he was aware that many others were still lurking ahead. In the distance, the city lights flickered, indifferent to the ongoing fight for justice happening in the shadows. David looked out toward the horizon, determined. Deep down, he knew he would keep fighting, even if it cost him his peace. Imagine being in David Kerrigan's shoes. What would you do if the person you swore to defend turned out to be the real villain? Would you keep your integrity and press on, or would you be tempted to cover up the truth to save your own skin? The final appeal reminds us that justice isn't always clear, and the cost of exposing the real culprit might be higher than we're willing to pay. If you were in David's position, what would your choice be? Would you have the courage to keep fighting, knowing the truth could destroy everything around you? Let us know in the comments how you would resolve this dilemma. And don't forget to subscribe.